This lesson will begin a study of the book of Exodus, and will cover the time from the death of Joseph to the self-exile of Moses. So we'll also have an optional ending part of the lesson that is going into detail about the timelines and all the controversies about that. So that's kind of optional. You can skip that if it doesn't bother you, but we'll add that on to the end. Excuse me. So Exodus is really a continuation of Genesis, and I see here I'm on the wrong chapter, so let me go back one if I can manage that. I'll figure this out someday. Let me just go to Exodus 1. And so we're continuing as Genesis left off with Israel safely settled in Egypt in the land of Goshen. And from the beginning of the narrative to the end, it covers about 430 years of history. Everything past chapter 2 only covers really 2 years from just before to just after Israel leaves Egypt. So it's important, though, we tend to skip over Exodus, other than the story about Moses crossing the Red Sea, but no other Old Testament book is quoted more by the New Testament writers, so we need to be familiar with it at least for that reason, because they will refer to it, and so we have to know what they're talking about. Now, as with Genesis, and in keeping with ancient Near East tradition, this historical account is not the dry list of facts and timestamps that Western history tends to use, but more of a colorful narrative that puts the reader in the story. That doesn't mean it's not factual. It just means that it's told in an engaging way. One of the key points we learned in the Genesis studies will continue on with Exodus, then that being that God has purposes and plans for things that seem from our perspective to not make any sense at all. Faith is easy when things go well and seem rational, but it's proved genuine when it endures through trying circumstances. That's the overall message. And you can find a helpful outline of the book of Exodus in Constable's notes, as linked in the description. And the display this time will have the Net's Septuagint Greek translation on the left and the Net Masoretic text on the right. So the New English translation has both a traditional Masoretic Old Testament translation and also the Septuagint. So I think it might be, I've compared it to other versions before, but I think it might be more helpful to compare the same version just using two different Old Testaments. So chapter 1 here really begins with verse 8, because the first 7 verses are a recap of how really Genesis ended, but it does add that the children of Israel increased and multiplied and became common, it says, which means they were everywhere and growing, and they kept multiplying. Now, some people try to put that as only after they were enslaved, but that's not true at all. We have it here, right here in verse 7, that began right away with the next generation. So verse 8 is where it tells us about the new Pharaoh, who has no regard for Joseph. You can look at the wording in the different original language texts and see how that's put. But it isn't just simply that he forgot Joseph existed. It's more of the connotation, at least in the Greek, that he just didn't care. So he looks at this rapidly growing nation of foreigners as a possible fifth column should Egypt be attacked, and that's why he enslaves them. Now, some people might think, oh, it's too small of a group of people, but when you see a population multiplying, and you know, because you're not stupid and you're educated in Egypt, that population growth is exponential, then you don't wait until it becomes a problem to try to head it off. So it doesn't matter how many people were in Israel at the time, just that they were multiplying rapidly, and it doesn't take, as they say, a rocket genius or a rocket surgeon, or however you want to put it, to figure out what's going to happen eventually. Now, to us, it seems like a poor strategy to enslave the people, since that kind of treatment is much more likely to motivate treason against the host country. But in a way, that's what it turns out to be, though not the way Pharaoh thought. Not because of an outside attack from another country and that Israel would turn on them, but to the fact that the more Pharaoh oppressed Israel, the more it prospered. they, he tried to stop their exponential growth, but he only made it worse by putting them to hard labor. So now we can see down here in verse 15 that Pharaoh decides to ignore that pesky little bit of cause and effect and try something else, plan B. He orders the Hebrew midwives to kill all the male babies, apparently before the mothers see them alive, based on what the midwives say when they're confronted by Pharaoh for not obeying him. In other words, it wasn't just that if you see it's a male baby, kill it. It's don't let the mother see that she had a live baby. They didn't want her to know that her children were being killed, or he would have a revolt on his hands. So he wanted it to look like natural stillbirths, and he wanted the midwives to carry this out. I think that's more the gist of what's going on there. But notice that the midwives use at least a partial cover story that since Hebrew women are strong and vigorous, likely another unintended consequence of the work they were forced to do, they went from labor to delivery much faster than the Egyptian women. So the boys were already born by the time they'd arrive. And that's what's telling us that it wasn't just a case of them saying, kill all the male babies. It was that you can't let the mother know you're doing it. So the fact that Pharaoh buys this excuse also seems to seal that kind of interpretation. And as Constable's notes point out, this plan is the only thing that miscarried. I thought that was an excellent play on words, an irony that he's trying to pretend that the babies of the Hebrews are miscarrying, but the only thing that miscarried is his plan. So for their bravery of the midwives, God blesses them with children of their own. Now, many Christians today believe that a woman disobeying a man is a terrible sin, the worst sin you can commit. But God is in the habit of treating women of valor like the adult human beings they are. We can see this in how he honored the midwives for risking their lives for what was right. Meanwhile, Pharaoh decides to dispense with the inconvenience of midwives and just orders his people to take any Hebrew male infant they find and throw it into the river, likely the Nile, as kind of a sacrifice to their river gods. But there's no mention of the people of Egypt actually carrying out this command. And we'll see an instance of that in the next chapter. So let's go down to chapter 2. And in our Genesis study, we learned that Levi was a wicked and violent man who was passed over as an elder son of Jacob. But we also learned that God can and will restore and reinstate people, such as Reuben, if they genuinely repent or if they don't follow in their wicked father's footsteps. So now we see an example of God's mercy in the birth of Moses, whose parents were of the tribe of Levi. God's sense of irony is shown here in that he turns the very method Pharaoh used to eradicate the Hebrews into the method of their eventual escape. So he's been telling the midwives to throw, or not the midwives, the Egyptians to throw Hebrew male babies into the river, but one of them is actually going to do that, and it backfires. So because we see there that Moses' mother hides him as long as she can, and then she makes this wicker basket out of papyrus, it says, coated with tar to make it watertight. So it's interesting here that the Hebrew word is the same as that used for Noah's ark, and those are the only two instances of that particular word in the Hebrew scriptures, is my understanding. So this is a kind of throwback to Noah's ark here, and it has the same purpose. So she puts the baby into the basket and sets it down in the river, which technically meets Pharaoh's requirement. She threw the baby in the river. She just made sure it wouldn't drown. So then Moses' older sister Miriam watches to see what happens to him. And let's go down to verse 5. We should know by now that this is all God's doing, because just then Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe in the river. She sees the basket, hears the baby crying, and though she knows it's supposed to be killed, this is what I was saying about the Egyptians not carrying it out, she rescues it anyway, but this is Pharaoh's own household, so that's kind of significant. Then Miriam wisely offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for her being the Egyptian, the Pharaoh's daughter, which unbeknownst to her will be the baby's natural mother, and she'll be paid for her services. Well played, Miriam. It took a lot of being wise and opportunist to just happen to be there for, to provide a nursing Hebrew mother for Pharaoh's daughter. And so now the mother not only gets, Moses' mother not only gets to keep Moses for longer, she gets paid for it. So again, well played on Miriam's part. But of course, the time eventually comes when the child must be handed over to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts him as her own son. I think from what I've read, it was weaning typically was up to about 5 years old or so. So she's the one who names him Moses because it means that she drew him out of the water. And this again shows how God uses foreshadowing, since later Moses will lead Israel across the Red Sea on dry ground. There's all sorts of parallels and repetitions, as we should have come to expect. And Constable points out another foreshadowing as well. It is all women who save Moses, who in turn will save Israel from extinction, which parallels the women who stayed with the condemned and crucified Christ after all but one of the men had run away. God is no respecter of persons, as it says, I think, in James. And we will also see later, I think it's in the book of Samuel, when he goes to choose King David, and Jesse, the father, parades all his older sons in front of the prophet to see which one he'll pick. And the prophet is like, well, this has got to be the guy. He's a big strapping guy. And God says, no, I don't judge by the flesh like people do. I judge by the heart. You would think Christians of all people would get that message because it's repeated in the New Testament by James. But they don't. They still want to judge by skin color or gender or some other fleshly matter that has nothing to do with a person's spirit or gifting. Anyway, as I said, Constable points out, this is not just me saying that it's all women who saved Moses. So then let's go down to verse 11. And it says that Moses grows up in the privileged life of Egyptian royalty, and so he was well educated and respected. But for reasons explained, if you look in Hebrews 11, 24 and 25, one day he goes out to see how his people are being treated, and he comes upon this Egyptian beating a Hebrew. So you can go check that section to find out what his motives were and some other little details. But in this passage also it says he looks around to see if anyone else is watching, and then kills the Egyptian, although probably not intentionally. He probably didn't go out to say, I'm going to murder this guy. He just, it just happened. It's just manslaughter or whatever they call it. If he had any inkling of his eventual role as Israel's savior, he went about it in the worst way. So he had no motive to do this. It was just, a spur of the moment. I see one of my own family line being terribly mistreated, so I'm going to take care of it. And inadvertently, I think, the Egyptian doing the mistreating was killed. Of course, this ends his career as a royal, because people always find out. And as we see there, the next day he tries to break up a fight between two Hebrews, and they resent his interference and ask if he's going to kill them too, just as he killed the Egyptian. So at this point, he knows he's dead meat, so he runs away to the land of Midian. Now down in verse 15, we see, of course, God's unseen guidance again, as Moses just happens to rest at a well where the daughters of a local priest come to draw water for their father's sheep. But they don't see Moses there at first, and then other shepherds come and try to push away the women, but Moses rescues them and helps them get the water they need. So they run to their father Reuel, who is also called Jethro in most other passages. It's not just a Septuagint thing. And they tell him that they were rescued by this Egyptian, and his response is he can't believe they just left him there alone. They didn't say anything, apparently. They just ran off to tell him and left Moses standing there. So he gets invited, Moses gets invited to the home of Reuel or Jethro, and in time he gives Moses his daughter Zipporah as his wife. Then down in verse 23, we see that a long time has passed, 40 years according to Acts 7:30, so that's where we get some more detail again. And finally, the Pharaoh who wanted to kill Moses is dead, but the people of Israel continue to suffer as slaves, and their crying out to him has reached the point where God will have Moses fulfill his true calling. Now, in the next lesson, we'll see how this calling happens, including a refutation of some needlessly divisive theories about the true name of God when we come to the account of the burning bush. But we need to clear up a few miscellaneous points before we end this lesson. And again, there will be another kind of a sub-lesson or auxiliary lesson tacked on to the end of this, but it's not a necessary part of this lesson. So one point is that there's no evidence that the Hebrews helped to build any pyramids. Okay, so they're always depicted as such, but there's no evidence that they had anything to do with it. They built cities. The second point is the use of the word Hebrew to describe the Israelites. It's first seen in Genesis, but it's likely derived from a descendant of Shem named Eber or Heber. So that's where that name comes from, if anybody's curious. And then the final point will be about the debate over calculating the number of years Israel was in Egypt. And you can study that at some of the links in the description. But the main point is the fact that it's been disputed for a long time shows that it isn't as clear as we'd prefer, but at least we can say that the integrity and inspiration of Scripture is not threatened by any of this. There is no clear argument against it. So I will go on now to cover my own analysis of that debate, and so you can skip the rest of the lesson if you want to at that point, if you're not so much interested in that debate. So let me bring up the chart that I made, because it's always easier to explain these things with a chart. It's the only way I could wrap my head around all these facts that were, being given in text form. It's really hard to follow. So I made this chart. I just finished it today. It took probably 2 days of reading and cross-checking and researching and getting different opinions from religious and secular sources alike, and differences among Christians even on the timeline. There's always going to be differences, but I approached this the way I approached my studies of prophecy in other videos that are not part of the lesson series yet, at least. Approach it like a jigsaw puzzle, and the first thing you do with a jigsaw puzzle is look for the corners and edge pieces, the boundaries, the places past which you can't go, or places that are very definite and clear as to where they fit. And there may be gaps in between the pieces. If you got the corners and edges, you have a lot of work to do within those boundaries, but at least you know where you can't go beyond. And that's the way I looked at this. We have some primary scriptures there at the top. Genesis 15:13 that we read in our earlier lessons, and this is a literal rendering, as I see it, of the Greek of the Septuagint there. And the seed, the seed, as Paul referenced in Galatians 3:16 and 17, he pointed out that it was singular, and it is singular in the Septuagint. It is also neuter, meaning it, the seed, it, will be a wanderer in a land not her own. It does use the feminine pronoun there. Probably, it goes with the word land, I think. I'd have to go back and check that. But it is definitely the feminine pronoun there, her. And it's not saying that the seed is a woman at all. It's not saying that here. It's just the technicalities of grammar, which points out that you can't build a theology on grammatical gender. You just can't. All it does is help you put words together in the sentence in Greek. So the seed is an it and is singular, as Paul points out, but Paul applies it to the Messiah, whereas in this context, it clearly applies to Isaac. He is the promised seed. He is an individual, so the singular isn't a problem. But the Messiah doesn't wander in Canaan. Although technically the land where Israel was used to be Canaan in Jesus' day, but Jesus wasn't wandering. He did move around a lot, but he wasn't wandering, although we could say also that he didn't have a home of his own, really, so it could fit. But as we know, you can't just take one fulfillment of anything. There are cycles that repeat. That's how the Bible is constructed. And that's no less true here. So we can apply this to Isaac. It's the primary application. And it says, that seed will be a wanderer in a land not his or her or its own, and they will enslave and oppress and humble them. And then kind of tacked on to the end of the sentence in Greek is 400 years. And this is what I think is causing a lot of confusion. Is we take that as for 400 years, but there's no word for there. There's not even an and. It just says wander in a land not their own, and they will enslave. That is to say, the other country will enslave and oppress and humble, and then it tacks on at the end 400 years. So that looks back, I think, to the whole sentence, which is wandering and enslavement and oppression. That takes 400 years. Then that verse goes on to say, then I will judge the enslaving nation. Then they, Israel, following the grammar there, will leave with many possessions. And then I skip a little bit of the passage and go down at where it says, the fourth generation will return to Canaan. This is cleared by the context, because the Amorites' sins are not yet complete. They haven't reached their full measure. So it's a difficult construction in Greek, but it looks to me very clearly that it's saying, first of all, the seed can and does apply at least to Isaac, and Paul makes it also apply to the Messiah, wandering in a foreign land and will be enslaved and oppressed, but the whole thing will take 400 years. And then at the end of that 400 years, Israel will leave with a lot of possessions. And it says that will happen by the fourth generation that returns to Canaan. And that's telling you they have to be out of Canaan before they can return there. They have to have been there, leave, and come back. And that the fourth generation, but from what? It doesn't tell us there. It just says the fourth generation. So, and we have to also keep in mind that one of those generations will be the last one that wanders. Because of their sins, we will find out later that God declares that that generation will not enter the promised land. So that's a generation. It doesn't have to be 100 years. It doesn't have to be 40. But it turns out it's just the people who were adults at the time that they committed these sins, that generation won't go in. So we can't be too overly precise on the term generation than the Bible gives us. And then the other passage at the top there, Exodus 12, 40 and 41, we'll get to that eventually. It says, the sons of Israel, they and their ancestors lived in Egypt and Canaan 430 years, and then they left. People gloss over this and they're reading the Masoretic text and going, oh, they were enslaved for 430 years. That is not what it says. It says the sons of Israel. If you stop there, you might think, well, this must be, all the 12 tribes leaders. But it says, and their ancestors. So this is going all the way back to Isaac at least. And Abraham lived in Canaan. So everybody in that line before and after lived in Egypt and Canaan. That whole thing is 430 years. Okay? So we're establishing our corners and edge pieces here. Now, if you look at the chart itself, what I'm doing here is trying to establish how many generations passed, how old people were, and how all sorts of things line up when you're really careful about this stuff. So let's skip the top part for now and just start here with Abraham. And Genesis 12:4, if you'll recall, told us that he was 75 years old when he received his call. Okay, his call that he was going to be out of his land and taken to a land he didn't know, to what turned out to be Canaan, or the Promised Land. And then 25 years later, he has Isaac. And then about 5 years after that, Isaac is weaned. But then we also know that Abraham was 100 years old by the text when Isaac was born, and Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born, and so on. You can see down the line there. But here's the thing about the ages of the 12 sons, because it isn't real clear. We aren't given as much detail about all of them. But we do know in that text box in the corner here, under the names, that Leah, excluding her servant and Rachel's servant, who each had 2 children, Leah had 7 children before Rachel had her first. Okay, so she had 6 boys and a girl, the girl Dinah, we remember her. So she had 7 babies before Rachel had Joseph. And there's a reference there, Genesis 30, 20, and 24, 20 through 24. If this spanned 10 years, and that's an if, and everybody's got nothing but ifs at this point, no matter who you ask, but it doesn't seem unreasonable. People just cranked them out in those days. And that was a woman's honor to do that. So if we take that as if, and a few years of infertility that happened, that's why the servants were brought in, we'll give it 10 years, okay, for all 7 of those children. Levi was the third of those children. So he would be, by process of elimination, 7 years older than Joseph, or close to that. We don't know what ages Levi, Kohath, and Amram were. Those were the descendants of Levi. We don't know their ages when the next son was born, as we have there for, we said that Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born. We don't have that for this line of Levi. But we do know that Levi had Kohath and one other child before moving to Egypt. That's in Genesis 46:11. And we also know that's one bookend. Now the other bookend for the time of slavery is that Amram was a slave by the time Moses was born. That's why the baby had to be put into the river. The slavery thing was already well underway before Moses was born. So his parents, Amram and Jochebed, were slaves. So, and we also know that it says in the text that not only Joseph, but all the brothers, all 12 of them, died before the new Pharaoh came to power. That's Exodus 1:6-8, as we just were looking at. So those are our bookends there. We know that slavery, as you can see in the kind of purple section here, that slavery had to be no later than the time that, beginning no later than before the birth of Moses. It couldn't start before that. That's why I have longest possible duration there, because we'll see the other end is the fact that Moses was 80 years old when the Exodus happened, and that's when the end of the slavery was. So there's our bookends. There's the longest possible duration I can get out of the text for how long the Israelites were in slavery. And we can see here these blocks are each 20 years long, so we have 120 years of slavery. Some people, other calculations I've seen have been as low as 144. So we're in the ballpark, and that's all we can hope for when we don't know every single age in detail. But I think it's reasonable because what the text does give us that's definite, our corners and edge pieces, is that Moses was born in slavery, and that slavery didn't begin until all 12 of the patriarchs were dead. Now here I went by at the earliest possible being the death of Levi. This is Levi's lifespan here. And if he was 7 years older than Joseph, then, and we know he lived 137 years, then this is when he died. And we could say, we don't know when the other ones died. There were younger brothers than he that were older than Joseph. So we don't know. But I'm taking that as the only firm thing I have, which is the inside limit, the earliest time that the new Pharaoh could come to power and start to worry about the Israelites. Now, also, before I go on, we have some markers here. The first darker red line is when Joseph came to power, okay? When he was made second in command to Pharaoh. And the reason was, this little green box here with the 2 7s in it, was the dream that Pharaoh had that Joseph interpreted, that there would be 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. So we also know from the text that it was 2 years into the famine when the rest of his family came to Egypt to live. Okay, so that's what the second red line is. The brighter red line is there's 5 years left of the famine. And that's, again, when the rest of his family came. So we also, the Septuagint has that there were 75 people all totaled. The Masoretic has only 70 people, but it's not a huge important difference. The point is that that's when they came, and that there were less than 100 of them. Okay, so we know Joseph's lifespan, we know Levi's lifespan, his son Kohath, and then Amram. We know their ages, and we know Moses' age, and that he was 80 when they left. And so we just work back from there. The wandering was 40 years. We tacked on to the end of the Exodus, and we know his total age, so it goes back to here. So Amram had to be fairly old, which is not unusual when you think about Abraham, who had been married to Sarah and didn't even have any children until he was 100. And then after that, after Sarah dies, he marries Keturah and has some more children. So it's not unheard of. It's not unbiblical, and certainly not even in the same range as Abraham was, over 100, but close to it. So, but that's all we can do. That's the corners and edge pieces constrain us to that. So we know that because Moses lived to be 80 before the Exodus, and that this is when he was born, that is the end of the slavery duration, as I said, so 120 years. That's what I can get from it. Now, the law and the promise, if you look at Galatians 3:16 to 17, and that's where it says most definitely when the promise was calculated from. Okay, he says or when the 430 years were calculated from the promise to the law. The law would be the Exodus, within a few years. So 430 years back from the Exodus is where we get this beginning point of when that's calculated, and that happens to be the time at which Abraham was first visited by God, and or actually, reiterated in 12:4. It was reiterated many times after that, but this is when we first, if we calculate back 430 years, as the Apostle Paul said, from the time of the giving of the law, we're at when Abraham was the age of 75. Now, what about the 400 years? Because we saw up there in Genesis 15 at the top that there is also 400 years. But again, that is the time of wandering to the time that they go back to Canaan. So when did the wandering start? Isaac. When was Isaac born and weaned? Right there. So it works out. You might say it's force-fitting, but again, I'm going by the Exodus and working back from there. And I'm also doing lifespans, timelines per what I had a chart in one of the earlier lessons about the time from Adam to Abraham, and how the Masoretic text has chopped off at least 600 years from the timeline. So I just continued with that. That's where I got the year 3280 from Adam up here. And as far as BC goes, it's fairly well established that the Exodus happened around 1446 BC. And BC is something we don't really have to dispute too much, within maybe 10 years at the most, the time of Christ. And most people who know anything about history or archaeology or any of these timelines issues will agree on about approximately that date for the Exodus. Okay, so if we go back from there 400 years, then 430 years in parallel, it winds up here, and it matches up the timeline I had done before with using the Septuagint, at least. It probably can be made to work with the Masoretic text, but the point is, I did not force fit. I'm just taking even the secular date for the Exodus and working back from the biblical statements, both testaments, and this is what we get. It happens that the 400 years starts with Isaac, and the 430 years starts with the promise, just as Paul said in Galatians. So it works out. Now, the last issue is population growth. We started with 70 or 75 people right here at this red line, and we have this many years to go to approximately 2 million. So we have, as I said, we got 20 years apiece here. There's 110, actually. Like 190 years. Okay? So 190 years to go from 75 to 2 million. Is that possible? I looked at all sorts of formulas and calculations and just made my head spin. So what I did was just sit down and try to use common sense. And here's what I have on the right, is that Israel is said to fill the land of Goshen in Exodus 1:7. We had read that, which happened to be, as far as I can figure out, about the size of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island currently has 1 million people living there, and that's not just the space for the people. You can fit the whole world's population in Texas, shoulder to shoulder. But the point is that they have all their stuff there, their buildings, their land, their livestock, whatever else goes on in Rhode Island. They can take care, they can support 1 million people on that land easily. So with the biblical material, if we take that each generation starts having children when the man is about 30, which was happening in Joseph's life, so we can't go back to pre-flood days or anything like that. But they did multiply, and here's the best case scenario for that, is that if each man starts having children when he's 30 years old, and they had multiple wives, that still went on then. So we'll just be conservative and only give them 2, and each of those wives has 8 children. That's not unprecedented by all the things we've seen so far. In fact, it's conservative. It's lowballing it. So going by that, and again, it's assumptions, but I think they're reasonable and valid. This is what I came up with, this progression here, this exponential growth, which is how populations work. If you have 16 children per man per generation, if we take half the population as the men of that first 70 or 75, and I'm being conservative using the 70, we have 35 men. Okay, those 35 have 16 children each. That's 560 children. And we'll say, again, that half of those are sons. So we put that in the next line, 280 times 16, and et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that in 5 generations, we have over 2 million people. Now we have, and that's just the men. So now we have to include the women, and that's the total population. I mean, that the men that we've been calculating, not that this number is just the men. This is everybody. But we include the women by adding up the second set of numbers, the total population, add up all the total populations, and then take away some because they're not all going to live the whole time. The prior generation dies off, and there's other causes of death, but population grows faster than more or the board can't talk today. Births outrun deaths. That's good for any country. So we'll take some away out of the 2.6 million, and we'll just say 2.5. We've taken away over 100,000 people. Okay, more or less. We're still way over what we need. We have 2.5 million. You could take that down to 2 million, and it's perfectly reasonable. So, as we'll see later in Exodus 12:37, it'll say that after they left, they had 600,000 men of fighting age, foot soldiers, basically. So that's not at all unreasonable out of a population total of 2 million. So that's how I arrive at the fact that I think everything fits together based on limited puzzle pieces. We don't have them all, but we have enough to get us in the ballpark without force fitting and with being very conservative and taking the worst case scenarios. So the fact that the Bible says that there was a large number of people that were threatening Pharaoh in the first place is not at all unreasonable. Even if you take it at the point where slavery begins, you still have perhaps 50,000 men of fighting age. And you can see, as I mentioned, that this is going to get worse and worse for Egypt as it goes along, and it's going to happen rapidly. So he wants to put a stop to it before it gets to that stage. But again, it didn't take much to see the handwriting on the wall for Pharaoh. So it didn't have to be 2 million people by that point to scare him into enslaving them. It didn't have to be. It only had to be a trend, which, since they were prospering and multiplying, he would put a stop to it, and everything he tried failed. But everything considered, whether it's from when secular history says the Exodus happened, to the lifespans were given, to generations and population growth and everything put together, this is what I come up with, and it fits the scriptures. It fits the Old Testament, it fits the New Testament, it fits the 400 years, the 430 years, the wandering, the oppression, all those things. If you read the passages carefully and don't read too much into them, such as people do when they're just surface skimming and say Israel was enslaved for 430 years, and then when they later come to Paul's statement in Galatians, they go, whatever. It shouldn't be good enough for a Bible student. And so this is why I did this chart. It took me like 2 days. But I think it's reasonable. So you will find other charts. One of them is listed in the description that has a slightly different timeline, but it is taking into the consideration the Septuagint. It has a few other differences. I think that one mistakenly includes the second Canaan that was mentioned in a video that I linked to on another lesson that has to do with how long Israel was in Egypt. So lots of things that you could look up on your own, but as you would probably find out, as I did when I tried to just read this stuff and go all over the Bible trying to find this information, this data, that it really helps to have a picture. And I probably wouldn't have any idea about any of this unless I drew a picture, because I just had to start writing down timelines. Okay, when, how many years did this person live? About when were they born? When was their next child born? And so forth, as they've done before. And then look for those corners and edges. That's all I did. And just out of curiosity, also, if you're going by BC, which again starts with Jesus, and so we can work our way back from there, the time of Abraham, I come up with, if I use my chart and use that this was, the Exodus was 1446 BC, then we come up with the birth of Abraham being about 1951 BC, which is well within the range that most people have shown, anywhere from 18-something BC to almost 22 BC. But it's in there, so that's good enough. And if we go by the, going by my charts as this year being 3280 from Adam, then I would say the current year 2018 is the year 7244. Now some people might be upset about that because they're thinking that this is upsetting the biblical statement in the New Testament that with the Lord a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years are as a day. But nowhere does the Bible in any context say that that must be referring to the years of human history all totaled. So this is why a lot of people try to force fit and use the Masoretic text for that. Creation to be about 4000 BC, because this is near the year 6000 total, so we must be nearing the millennium. I don't have a problem with that not being supportable by the scripture that has us at the year 7,000 something by most accounts from creation, because that's not a necessary plank in anybody's eschatology that this has to be the year 6000. It doesn't have to be. So all that statement is saying in the New Testament is that God doesn't reckon time the way we do. And if we get impatient, it's because, as it says, I think it's in Peter, 2 Peter, says that God is not being slow as we see it, but being patient so that more people can be saved. So God has his reasons. We have to have learned to trust him by now, studying through Genesis and now getting into Exodus. And again, I think if anything, this should be a confidence booster, not a just seeing what we want to see, but seeing what can be rationally deduced from rationally. I don't know why I said rationally, but anyway, makes sense and isn't irrational to say that this chart is probably accurate within anybody's reasonable expectations. So there you go. I think that's all for this part of the lesson, and next time we'll go on to chapter 3 of Exodus.